Next on Sisterhood of the Second Act.
Mary Llewellyn McNeil has an impressive resume. She was a journalist at the Winston-Salem Journal, editor at the Smithsonian Institution and the National Academy of Sciences, as well as degrees from Wake Forest University and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Now she's written her first biography on one of the most influential journalists of the 20th century. It's won gold medals in top national publishing programs. Not too bad for a first time out. Mary joins us today to talk about Century's Witness, the extraordinary life of journalist Wallace Carroll. To say Waynette Anderson is a self-starter is an understatement. The multi-business owner runs a successful music venue and an event planning business. Now she's sharing what she's learned in a motivational series called Grace and Grit. She's here to tell us about it. We'll meet these women on this edition of Sisterhood of the Second Act.
I'm gonna be an oak tree.
I think I'll be a dogwood tree.
My kids said they'd be looking for a thorny tree for me.
With Evergreen, you can be a tree. Our biodegradable urn combines your ashes, natural soil additives, and a native tree of your choice. Be a tree and grow for tomorrow.
I want to be a tree.
Learn more at evergreenmemorialtrust.com.
Looking for your first home or retirement home? Realtor Monica Nicely can help you find it. Whether you're moving in or out of the Roanoke region, call Monica 540-449-2019, 540-449-2019. Alcova Mortgage Loan Officer Jonathan Sweat helps you seal the deal with the loan to suit your needs with great rates and terms. Call Jonathan 540-314-8843, 540-314-8843.
Alcova Mortgage, Equal Housing Lender, NMLS ID number 40508, MLSConsumerAccess.org. Terms and conditions apply. All loans subject to credit approval.
Now from the Fox Radio Roanoke studios, this is Sisterhood of the Second Act.
Welcome to Sisterhood of the Second Act. I'm Denise Allen Membrano. Century's Witness, the extraordinary life of journalist Wallace Carroll, has won gold medals for biography in the 2022 Indies Book of the Year Awards and the 2023 IBPA Benjamin Franklin Awards. It tells the story of Wallace Carroll, one of the most respected and influential journalists of the 20th century. It is affectionately penned by his former student, Mary Llewellyn McNeil, who joins us today. She has an impressive resume of her own, and she's here to tell us more about Century's Witness. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
We really appreciate it. Just to let people know a little bit about you. Some of your resume: former editor and writer for the Congressional Quarterly and the primary author of Environment and Health, Reagan's First Year and the Nuclear Age, plus a 28-year career at the World Bank, starting 2 global publications there. That's amazing. Amazing career on your own. You studied under Wallace Carroll, so what did you learn from him that you took with you throughout your career?
Well, it's interesting when you're of a certain age, when you're in college, if you're lucky, you run into people that just stay with you. And I learned and took a lot with me from Wallace Carroll that I didn't always realize until I got out of college and got into the work world. He was a quiet man and a humble man, but he had a certain charisma that made you want to do your best for him, and you didn't want to let him down. And he taught me some basic principles about writing, about journalism, about truth-telling. I took a course on the First Amendment from him, and at the time I didn't know much about him other than he was a visiting lecturer at the school, and he had been the publisher and editor of the city paper in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I went to Wake Forest, which is in Winston-Salem. And I didn't really understand how accomplished, frankly, he had been in his life prior to teaching and prior to even being the editor and publisher of the city paper, because he never talked about what he had done in the past. So I learned a lot of, humility, what it means to be a very achieved person, but not someone who is necessarily telling you everything about what they've done. And that was a big reason why I wanted to write his biography.
When did you know that you were going to write that story?
Right. I was working, as you mentioned, at the World Bank for many years, and I retired in 2015. And I was doing consulting, doing international development work, and I was in London on a trip, and I came across a book called Citizens of London, which is about 3 men who were in London just beginning of the World War, in beginning of the Blitz, and they were working very hard to basically bring the United States into the war to help Great Britain. Edward R. Murrow, the very well-known famous journalist, was one of them. Averell Harriman was another one, and then a guy named Gil Waynette, who happened to be the United States ambassador to the UK during the war. And I'm reading the book, and I'm seeing the name Wallace Carroll popping up everywhere. And I thought, is this my professor? And apparently he had been head of United Press in London beginning in 1939 and through the beginning of 1943. And therefore he knew these gentlemen quite well. And it just piqued my interest because I was a history major. I was always interested in World War II. And I thought maybe there's more here about what he had done than I knew about.
Right. So why is now the time to tell his story?
I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of them is this lack of trust we have in the media now. I mean, all the polls show that Americans don't trust the media the way they used to. And back when he was an editor, trust was much higher. Of course, it was a different world because we didn't have the internet, we didn't have cable news even, and people got most of their news from the written newspapers. So the people that were writing and editing the newspapers really were the ones leading the flow of news. And now, and many of them were very respected because they felt this responsibility to not necessarily take one side or the other, but to write about the facts, back up the facts with context, try to tell the truth. And now we have a different media environment.
Right.
We have much more, you could call it one-sidism, you know, both on the left and on the right. And I think that is why it's led to us having a lack of trust now, because people aren't sure exactly what the facts are, what the truth is, because they're hearing 2 different sides of the same issue.
Right.
Sometimes
so polarized that it's you're like, where is the truth?
Right. That's the first reason I think it's a relevant story. The second reason is that Wallace Carroll, at the height of his career, he started off as a foreign correspondent in Europe, and then he was the news editor of the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, which is a very high-profile position, and he decided to leave that position to go and become the editor of a regional newspaper because he believed in the local news. He believed in independence, and he liked the independence that he would have doing that. And now we have a real crisis in terms of local newspapers. They have been dying across the country. The business model is broken, and in many areas there is no written news covering localities, towns, and even medium-sized cities are suffering from this. So I think that his example of leaving the spotlight to go put his efforts to something that was more local was also something I think very relevant today.
And people don't realize what a loss that is when you lose that paper. It's a loss to local democracy. We are talking with Mary McNeil, author of Century's Witness, The Extraordinary Life of Wallace Carroll. And you said that he wasn't one to sing his own praises, so as you were investigating his life, what surprised you? I'm sure there were a lot of things that popped up.
Right. Well, it was like peeling an onion, because the more I looked into what he had done, the more I couldn't believe everything he had done, and everybody that he knew. He went to Europe in 1929 as a United Press correspondent, was in London for a few years, then in Paris, and then he went to cover the League of Nations, which was the body charged with ensuring the peace in the late 1930s. And he saw front and center, being there among all the diplomats, the rise of Mussolini, the rise of Hitler. He went and covered the Spanish Civil War. And then in 1939, he became the United Press chief in London on the brink of World War II. So that was a lot of historical eyewitness stuff that he was involved in. But then after he had covered the Blitz and the Battle of Britain, he thought, well, you know, we can have a break now. The Blitz was over for a while, but his boss asked him to go into Russia when the Nazis invaded in 1941. Wow. So he was one of the first correspondents. He had a very hair-raising trip up through the Arctic Circle to get there. He covered the advance of the Nazis in Moscow, went to the front lines, and then he had to leave Moscow. So he traveled east in a very adventurous story, which is all in the book, by camel, rowboat, railway, plane, and went to the Philippines, got on a boat, and then arrived in Pearl Harbor 3 days after the December 7th attack. So he was one of the first correspondents to actually see the devastation and report on it. So he was a little bit like the Forrest Gump of its time in that he seemed to be present at all these big events and seemed to know everybody who was famous. You know, he interviewed Churchill several times. He knew Eisenhower, he knew Roosevelt. So, you know, it was just a fascinating story.
And he seemed to always know or just have this instinct to be where he was going to be. I mean, you know, was it his observational skills that let him say, oh, and I think this is going to happen next, let me go here? Experience, or is this just a gift?
When I asked people about that, they said he had what's called peripheral vision, in that, you know, he was a very intelligent man, and he was able, I think, it wasn't just luck. I think he had an ability to, because of his experience of what he had seen on the European continent and everything, to kind of be able to place himself in a weird way where the action was going to be taking place. I did think he had a talent for that. He also was lucky. I mean, he was lucky to land where he did in certain occasions. But he was very strategic in his thinking. He was really advanced in terms of his understanding of foreign policy. And I think that helped guide him and helped him be in these situations where other people maybe have missed it. He was one of the first people when England declared war against Germany. He was waiting outside 10 Downing Street for that announcement to be made, one of only 2 reporters that knew that it was going to happen. He had excellent contacts. He was very respected as a source because he was very discreet. He didn't, you know, let loose on things that he had promised people that he wouldn't do. So I think all that contributed to why he was able to do and be the kind of journalist that he was.
And I know from reading your book that he felt that truthful, unbiased journalism could affect change, and it did in several. Before we leave here today, I wanted you to talk about his editorial, which is different than reporting, because reporting, you show both sides, but in an editorial, as the editor of Winston-Salem, of the Journal, he wrote this editorial that you wrote about in your book about Vietnam. Can you tell a little bit about that story?
In 1968, he did write an editorial. He had actually been a Cold Warrior. He was not against the Vietnam War at the very beginning, but the more he observed it and the more he saw how it was being reported on, he really came to the conclusion that the United States should begin to think about pulling out, that it wasn't in the best interests of the United States. And so he wrote this editorial, and it was very logically written. You know, he had 7 points, boom, 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 why it was not in the best interests of the United States to stay in the war. And he had a lot of contacts in the administration, one of whom was a guy named Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State for Truman and was advising Lyndon Johnson on the war. And Acheson put this editorial on Lyndon Johnson's desk and said, "You really should read this." And numerous accounts say that it really convinced Johnson, A, not to run again, this is in 1968, and B, to really draw back on the war. And at that time, the editorial was on the front pages of newspapers all across the country because he, although not famous to the general public, was very well known within the journalism community. Mm-hmm. So editors would see this, they would see it with Wallace Carroll, and they put it on their front pages. So he did affect policy. He felt the press could do that it was all right to do that. He believed that newspapers should give readers the information, the context, the rationale. They could make up their own minds,
right.
But it needed to be based on rational thinking based on the facts. And one last thing is he had a philosophy which he published in the 1950s called The Tyranny of Objectivity. He didn't feel as a journalist that if someone was lying, you had to report that lie. And he thought that had contributed to the rise of Eugene McCarthy in the 1950s. And so he felt that newspapers should not be used in that, you know, someone would say something outrageous and then it would be covered on, you know, more publicity given to the liar. He didn't think that was the way you should behave as a, you know, he didn't think that was the right way to do journalism.
Because you're supposed to be reporting the truth.
Right, the truth, which he believed in.
We could talk for the whole 30 minutes.
Right,
I really appreciate you
right.
being here today.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
And we will have Mary's contact information in our show notes at sisterhoodofthesecond.com. Coming up, multi-business owner Waynette Anderson shares her experiences through a motivational speaking series to help others reach their goals.
Looking for your first home or retirement home? Realtor Monica Nicely can help you find it. Whether you're moving in or out of the Roanoke region, call Monica 540-449-2019, 540-449-2019. Alcova Mortgage Loan Officer Jonathan Sweat helps you seal the deal with the loan to suit your needs with great rates and terms. Call Jonathan 540-314-8843, 540-314-8843.
Alcova Mortgage, Equal Housing Lender, NMLS ID number 40508, MLSConsumerAccess.org. Terms and conditions apply. All loans subject to credit approval.
Once again from the Fox Radio Roanoke Studios, Sisterhood of the Second Act. Welcome back to Sisterhood of the Second Act. I'm Denise Allen Membrano. Waynette Anderson has mastered the airwaves through her work in Roanoke in radio and television. And when it came time to start her own business, she stuck with what she knows and loves, bringing people together and entertaining them. She started Sponsor Hounds Incorporated 15 years ago and launched River Rock Entertainment Incorporated in 2015, which does business as the venue, Dr. Pepper Park at the Bridges in downtown Roanoke. Now she's sharing what she's learned as a marketing expert, venue operator, and entrepreneur in a motivational series called Grit and Grace. And thank you so much, Waynette, for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, as we were talking earlier, you know that I first saw you when you were doing that Cox 9 fun program called Whatever.
Yep.
At the same time, you were also a marketing rep for Star Country. What made you step away from that and start Sponsor Hounds?
Well, that's a good question. I did the TV show mainly because I like to overcome things that I'm fearful of. And so cameras and being on TV used to scare me to death. And I'm sure that you realize, being in the business as long as you have, like, you could probably hold up a bank with a camera. People do not want to be on camera. And I was the same way. And really for 2 years, I would get very sick right before we would go on, and I'd just excuse myself and come back. And it really took about 2 years to kick the nerves of that. And then I met my husband towards the tail end of that, and I just really, the way they had the filming was every weekend, and I did it to overcome my fear of TV, but then I also wanted to force myself out into the public so that I could meet people, because I'm really kind of a homebody. I like to be at home. And so I met my husband, and he was like, I want to spend more time with you. So I said, okay, that's what I'll do. And then with Star Country, I really love the radio station and the group, the Wheeler Broadcasting Group. And I was very, very good at it. I was the top biller in the company for a number of years, which, by the way, I didn't know until the day I gave my resignation. So I was like, I thought I was working really, really hard. So just through that, I learned what was going to make my heart happy. I believe that every path that I've been on has led me to the place I am today. And through working with local businesses and understanding what their needs were, helped me with event marketing as well. And also, knowing a lot about music, just everything kind of was leading me down that path. I loved radio marketing, and I loved meeting with new clients, but I started creating a lot of event opportunities for my clients that would help to supplement their radio schedules and also accomplish many of their advertising goals. And through that effort, I found that gave me great joy. And the energy of an event, people waiting in line, and the excitement and the buildup for the event, created pre-concert parties and lots of fun things that we did with Star Country. And just through that, I was like, this is what I really want to do. And I didn't know what that meant, but at the time, I knew that I wanted to do that the rest of my life.
So you mentioned that led to Sponsor Hounds, and then Sponsor Hounds led to Dr. Pepper Park.
Yes.
And historically, event booking, music booking in particular, has been male dominated. What challenges did you have to overcome when you started Dr. Pepper Park? I mean, basically, you carved this out of it was never there before.
Yes. What I had recognized in our market specifically is that there just were a lot of things that were not serving our community. We didn't have a lot of entertainment. You probably can remember, actually, this year will be our 17th year with Sponsor Hounds. We didn't have a lot of trade shows or concerts and festivals and things like that. So I was just really looking to address that need in our community. And through that, I created a number of trade shows, festivals, and events. I acknowledged early on with Sponsor Hounds that really, to have a sustainable business model, I was going to need to carve out my own venue space that I could program and activate as I needed to. A lot of great venues in this market, obviously, they have the same goal to keep it activated as often as possible. So it was difficult to get the continuity of dates that we needed. And then some of the shows that we used to produce, they just sort of fell out of a need in the market based on what was currently happening in the world. Like the internet really took a lot of online sales. So many of the vendors that used to travel to do the trade shows, like the Outdoor Sportsman's Classic and the Blue Ridge Bike Fest, and a number of other expos that I created and produced, we were just finding it difficult to find vendors because they were like, we put all of our business on the internet, and that's something we didn't anticipate. We learned through that we really found more joy in doing concerts than anything else. So we began the long search for our own property, which took 5 years, and we were close on a couple different properties early on, but they just kept falling through because, as you can imagine, the zoning and parking and all of those things are big pieces of the puzzle that needed to exist. And of course, it needed to be easy to get to for all of our guests to come by after work and enjoy the concert. So when the Bridges development started, I went and met with their developers and pitched my idea. And I'm very excited that it was already deemed acceptable for an event space on that mixed-use development.
That's amazing. And the rest is history, basically, because this outdoor venue has become a mainstay in the area.
Yes, we've been voted best live music venue year after year after year. So it's very humbling that we have been, and I always say, like, we were an overnight sensation that took 8 years to make. Yeah. So, some people are still finding us.
So with that wide variety of television, radio, and sales experience, now you're on this new venture, which you're becoming a motivational speaker. How did that come about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would go to a lot of these different events, and I would see people stand up and talk, and they just spoke so freely and eloquently and just didn't seem nervous at all. And, there's so many people that are afraid of public speaking, and so I wasn't alone. And I'd sit in my chair and I'd politely smile and nod and just be envious that they could stand up there and do that, and I knew I couldn't. So I would kind of excuse it away and say, well, they're adults, they've been doing this. And then one day it occurred to me, well, daggone it, I guess I'm an adult too. So I started telling people that I would really like to do that, because I get a lot of questions about what I do and how I got where I am, and what my background was. And so I wanted to share that with other people. And so I hired a coach that helped me develop my public speaking skills, and she was just it was really life-changing, really helped me a lot. And through that, we talked about like what people want to know most about me and my businesses. And so I created 3 signature speeches. So depending on who my audience is, I let them pick, what they want to know the most about. A lot of people are just really hyper-focused on, they want to know everything about Dr. Pepper Park, and they find the entertainment and music industry so interesting that they want to ask me all these questions and want to know, how did it get built and how did I have this vision? So I have a speech for that, and I have one that's about overcoming adversity and accomplishing your goals through any adversity. And then, of course, how I first started Sponsor Hounds and continued to stay in business is, creating Plan A thinking, a mindset that doesn't need a backup plan. And that's the one that a lot of people ask me about. And so it's great. Because I am a female, I do get asked to speak a lot at female conferences and events. And I don't mind that at all. But really, what I'm talking about is across all genders.
Right.
So, but I guess because I'm a female, I'm asked to speak at a lot of female events.
We are talking with marketing expert, venue owner, and entrepreneur Waynette Anderson. You're from Hampton, Virginia. Mm-hmm. Do you incorporate your personal experiences as well as your business experience when you're doing these talks?
Sure. Yeah, I talk about where I grew up and my background, and a lot of things that happened to me when I was younger. I always will love the Hampton, Virginia area because I grew up next to all that water, and I'm just a beach baby, so I do love the beach. If there's some way I could bring it closer to the mountains, I would be so happy. So I do miss the salt air and all those things. But it occurred to me one day while I was at Dr. Pepper Park, because a lot of people don't realize this, but our warehouse doesn't have water or electricity or anything. It's just a shell, a storage building. And we're trying to create something out of nothing. We don't really have a lot of resources at our disposal. And I was like, this is just like when I was a kid. And I realized that I've actually been planning events my entire life, because where I grew up, I was very poor. The kids in the neighborhood didn't have anything to do. And so I just took it upon myself to create these events with stuff I had laying around the garage. One time I did a carnival, one time I did Olympics. And for prizes, I just asked everybody to grab whatever they had around the house that they weren't using, toys and that sort of thing. And it's interesting that that's what I've always been doing, but I didn't realize it until I got all the way to Dr. Pepper Park that I've been doing this my whole life. So
that is very interesting.
Yes.
So what's behind the name Grace and Grit?
Well, I mean, really, when in talking with my coach, she was like, I think that you should use both of these things, because there are a lot of times in my career in the development of the businesses that I had to step back and just really offer grace, whether it was grace and forgiveness or grace in my approach, grace in negotiating. And then with the grit side of things, you're always going to encounter distractions, adversities, challenges. And so you've got to be really strong in your convictions and in your vision to go back to that vision each and every time. And that takes grit. And that grit doesn't mean being nasty. It just means to be strong in your convictions, because really you can only count on yourself to understand and see your vision through. You have to understand that not everybody will get on board with it. So you have to have the grace to show them that this is your vision, and the grit to stay the course.
So as we start to wrap up, what do you hope people attending your talks? What do you hope they take away?
You know, I never really intended to be a motivational speaker. That was not my goal. I just wanted to reach more people, and somehow that has become inspirational. A lot of women send me cards and emails and notes. They meet me after the event and they tell me that, you know, I've really inspired them to follow their own plan A, or that it was very motivational. I never realized the effect that just telling my story would have on people. So I just feel like that's what I need to be doing. And you know, it also helps to promote what I do at Dr. Pepper Park at the Bridges. So through that effort, I've gained a lot of support through new sponsors and new guests.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And we will have Waynette's contact information in our show notes at sisterhoodofthesecond-act.com.
I'm going to be an oak tree.
I think I'll be a dogwood tree.
My kids said they be looking for a thorny tree for me.
With Evergreen, you can be a tree. Our biodegradable urn combines your ashes, natural soil additives, and a native tree of your choice. Be a tree and grow for tomorrow.
I want to be a tree.
Learn more at evergreenmemorialtrust.com.
I want to thank Mary McNeil and Waynette Anderson for being with us today. You can learn more about Mary's book, Century's Witness, and Waynette's speaking series, Grace and Grit, at our website, sisterhoodofthesecond-act.com. Join us next week for another edition of Sisterhood of the Second Act.